Thank you so much, Barry, for that lovely introduction. Hi, everyone. This is Jesse Bradley of Storytime with Jesse Bradley. Each and every time that I do this, I create a mostly true story based on specific prompts as memory. And I say mostly true because memory is fallible. We remember things the way that we remember them. They are true to us, but not necessarily factual, as we all perceive things very differently, such as the Berenstein versus Berenstain Bears. Some housekeeping things that I do here is I let people because whatever I come up with, I may delve into some very sensitive subjects. So I don't know what happens whenever I tell a story. So this is just a blanket content warning that there are sensitive subjects that may be discussed. So we're going to find out what happens. The other thing as well is that any people that I reference, their names or sometimes even locations are changed unless I have explicit permission to talk about them. So this season, I've been doing my prompts a little bit differently. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I actually have my desktop ready to go. And what I am doing this time is I have a series of comic strips, nonfiction comic strips that autobiographical that I've been doing on Sundays with Meow Meow Pow Pow Lit for their blog. It's called Life Hacks with Jesse Bradley. So for this season, I have some life hacks that I actually have made into comic strips. Some of them I actually have made into comic strips, some of which I'm going to make into comic strips. So I'm going to ask Barry, since you're the only one in the room with me, if you could pick, just use a number in the chat. And that's the story that we're going to go with. So we are going to go with 3. So 3 is how to be a poet instead of a good person. That is fantastic. And this would have been even more fitting if this was done in April for National Poetry Month. I may have to do another version of this story for National Poetry Month. So that's actually pretty funny. All right. So I am going to tell a story about how to be a poet instead of a good person. It is 1995. We've got Bill Clinton in office. Alternative music is at its peak. Like everything is absolutely and totally awesome, except this guy right here. In high school, I am like weirdo outcast. I've got long hair. I wear 9 Inch Nails t-shirts and Pulp Fiction t-shirts. My glasses are like big gold rimmed. I'm brushing my teeth more because, I want a girl to kiss me very much. That was something I used to not do as a self-defense weapon in middle school. I was known as Death Breath. But in order for girls to kiss me, I knew I need to brush my teeth more. And I want to be a writer at this point. I want to be a writer so bad, but it's not really like doing things for me and whatnot. And I end up going out on, it wasn't really a date though. I go to homecoming with a friend and his girlfriend, and it was supposed to be a double date. And she decided not to show up because, well, it was a blind date. There was no way for her to see my picture, and she didn't appreciate being like set up with this weird stranger dude. And she ends up showing up. Melanie shows up at this homecoming dance, and we hit it off, and it is absolutely wonderful and amazing. This is the first girl that actually like wants to talk to me. We actually go out on dates. Our first date was seeing the movie Seven, and then I got to see a Nine Inch Nails concert in a very small club. It was the best night of my life. And as we are talking, for some, like over the phone, because that's what you did in 1995, you had a lot of conversations over the phone. She read me a poem, and I think it was an Emily Dickinson poem. I don't entirely remember what the poem, who it was, and what it was, but it was a poem of some kind, and the light bulb went off in my head. I could write a poem. I could write a poem, and I could potentially, write a poem to maximize my chances of getting girls and whatnot, because I really didn't have any sort of useful skills as a 15, 16-year-old. I mean, I had great hair and I had great eyelashes, and I could babysit my younger brother while my mom worked at night. But those were the most skills that I potentially had. So I ended up writing this poem, and it was called Rant and Rave, and it has all the things that a 16-year-old poet would do, like rhyming insanity with banality, lots of references to oblivion. Everything is sad and dark and blah. And I read it to her, and I wrote this poem in my black 5-star notebook because, on theme, everything is black notebook, black pen, black soul, so on and so forth. And I read this poem over to her, over the phone to her, and she's like, "Oh my God, it's brilliant." And not like brilliant as in a sarcastic way, that a slightly older, she was a senior, I was a junior at that time. Not only did this slightly older woman really like the poem, like she liked me and she liked the poem, and immediately the light bulb went off in my head. I go, hey, I could make this a thing, and I could potentially do this. So I ended up writing poems, and because of her, and I actually wrote her a birthday poem when her birthday came up, and things that didn't work out in the end because her ex-boyfriend came back into her life, and clearly she was more into him than into me. So I scratched out that particular poem and I moved on. But the poetry stuck around, and I wrote just massive amounts of poems in my notebook, and I would start performing them at open mics because maybe I could perform a poem, and maybe someone who I might think is cute might like hear me in the audience, and they might want to like take me home. And just the math, it was not necessarily about fame, and it was just more about romance and love and getting laid. And where things get into a turn is I discover in 2001. Backtrack here. In the year 2000, I discover a documentary called Slam Nation. Slam Nation is a documentary that was filmed at the 1996 National Poetry Slam in Portland, Oregon. So to backtrack a little bit from here, up until I think about 2018 or 2018, that was the final one. There used to be a national poetry slam in which teams from all over the US and Canada and sometimes internationally converged for 4 to 5 days, and they competed. There was actual competitions here where basically it was like 4 teams or 5 teams. You got 2 nights of competition guaranteed, and the top 20 or 25 teams competed in a single elimination semifinal, and then the big old finals, and then the winners got like $2,000, $2,500 or whatever, and recognition within the community, and be able to book gigs in the community. Because the other thing about Poetry Slam at that point was you could actually make a living if you're willing to sleep on couches and travel all over the country and perform. If you did well at Poetry Slam on a national level, you would get offered to do gigs and whatnot. It's one of the few literary things that actually, like, one, pays people for their time and actually supports people, unlike other art forms. And I saw this documentary, and these poems, this is a format that was invented by this Chicago construction worker named Mark Smith. And he did in 1986, and he did this so he wanted to get poetry away from academia and back with people. And he figured out, like, to get people really engaged, you would select 3 or 5 random audience members, and they would score to each poem on a scale from 0 to 10. And the spiel that I use when I used to host poetry slams is 0 is a poem so bad that you would go travel back in time and convince the poet's grandmother to abort their parent, and 10 being a poem so amazing it would make Jesus lactate rainbows. It's hyperbole, I know. And watching this documentary and seeing, like, this performance poetry and people getting numbers and getting scored, I was hooked. I was enthralled. I'm like, this is the coolest fucking thing I've ever seen in my life. The catch is that Orlando had no poetry slam whatsoever at this point. Like, poetry slam wasn't really a thing, didn't really exist. So there was no mechanism for Orlando to send a team or, like, compete on a national level. So I am it's 2001, and I am in an English honors fraternity, Sigma Tau Delta, and I decide, you know what, fuck it, I am gonna start a poetry slam because I want to compete in a poetry slam. I want to absolutely compete. I want to, like, be able to do these things that these poets are doing. And, you know, I want to sleep on couches and get paid to do poetry. It just sounds so absolutely amazing. I want to start with this poetry slam. And so I decided to do it with my mom. And so the frame of reference for my mother, at this point in her life, she was doing freelance stuff for various concert promoters or whatnot. She knew how to put on events and had production experience. And I decide that I'm like, okay, I decide that I need her help. And she doesn't want me to compete in poetry slams because she thinks it's really unethical for an organizer to do it, even though that there are organizers all over the place who do it. They run poetry slams and they also compete as well. And so because she wants me to be basically the Bob Barker of poetry slam, that this is something that she's like, no, it's more important for you to be the host and the producer than it is for you to actually perform. And in the back of my head, I'm like, okay, that's bullshit. But also I'm living with her, and she has threatened multiple times to throw me out. And even though she, and then eventually reneges on her threats, and I don't want to really deal with it. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and do it and whatnot. And we, through the partnership, our first year, we don't send any teams. We just kind of get our feet on the ground and build a foundation. And we decide in 2002 that we're going to go ahead and send it. We're going to go ahead and send a team. And we do. We have, like, and I'm not competing, I'm hosting and whatnot. And we eventually select a team, and they're the really talented people in Orlando. And we're like, oh yeah, there's they're going to be great. They're going to be amazing. We bust our asses and we do fundraisers for these folks, and things get really sour because egos get involved, and we don't really raise any money to, like, send the team. Like, I end up going as the slam master. That's what organizers were called. And this is in Minneapolis in 2002. And I'm broke. I just finally got a job, a what my mother would say is a real job as a sixth grade English teacher. And they agreed to give me the time off because this is a huge deal. So I go and I'm struggling. Um, and we're all thinking like, okay, we have a really good team. We're going to do really well and whatnot. And the very first night, we do well for the first two rounds. Like we are actually like in the lead, and it's like, oh my god, holy crap, we could actually do this. We could actually pull this off. And until the third round, when we start losing, and then we go from first to third out of four teams, and it's kind of a gut check at this point because everyone, including myself, is thinking like Orlando has the best poets. Like we're really talented and really good. And as we witnessed at the National Poetry Slam, it was not like it was. We got gut checked essentially, and because we sucked and we didn't do well. I eventually finally take the poetry slam fully over from my mother, and she is very angry that I have done this. But at this point, I think I'm living on my own. So this is actually almost living on my own. So this makes it a little bit easier. And we struggle for a little bit. And I'm doing really well romantically in terms of like it getting laid through poetry. I'm doing really well. I have girlfriends and one-time fun things with people as a result of it. And at the same time, even though I have the live journal poems to prove it, that as I read them, like these are terrible poems. These are awful poems. But when you're in your 20s and you're being validated with affection, it's like, these are the best poems ever. These are absolutely and utterly amazing poems. This is working. So I'm so focused on writing poetry and being in this poetry slam that I'm not a really good partner to my romantic partners. And one of my relationships at that point in 2003 ends rather just spectacularly, where I'm forced to move out because my then girlfriend leaves me for another woman, and then the other woman realizes this was just not a good idea and ends up leaving her. Early 2000s drama, as you do when you're in your early 20s and whatnot. And while I'm also running the poetry slam, I end up meeting Miranda, who ends up being my first wife. And like Miranda also, I end up getting her involved, and she ends up being a host, and she's really funny, and she's a Puerto Rican Spitfire who's just absolutely amazing, but also drinking really heavily as a host, because she gets free drinks. And we never really go anywhere travel wise outside of going to national poetry slams. Like where couples, they would take vacations and they would go to places. My obsession with it being the next like big slam poet, like being on Def Poetry Jam, like having a team, and like all of these things like meaning so much that I make it that a priority and not our relationship a priority. And she's okay with it because the partying is great, but it's honestly an obsession at this point in my life, where I have the poetry slam and I'm doing these things. And I start to realize as I run the poetry slam, and it takes some time to realize this, is that I'm not really good as a slam poet. Like there's this very specific style and form that slam poets have to do to succeed well. And I'm starting to realize, especially as I start transitioning to more traditional literary formats and getting published in magazines, that I can write a poem. I'm good at writing poems, but maybe I'm not really good at slam, at being a slam poet. And I'm coming to this realization on my own. And Uh, the last time I try out for a team is the 2007. Was it 2007 or 2008 or nine? Jesus. 2009 National Poetry Slam, which was actually in our backyard in Florida, in West Palm Beach, Florida. And I was just so close. I did really well in my more evolved style, and I just missed the cut. We took the top five, and I was sixth. And I was like, all right, you know what? I'm just going to support. I'm going to go and support. I am going to not have any ego whatsoever. I'm going to volunteer. I'm going to show up as a member of the team, not a member as not a member of the team, but just as support. And my Miranda at this point, we're married, so she's there with me to also like volunteer and party and whatnot. And like my ego, I was like, I realized that it was not going to be a good slam poet, that I could still be a poet, but maybe not for slam. And I put my ego aside for the first time, and the team did spectacularly well without me being involved, because even I knew I didn't have the patience to be a coach. I wasn't a good coach at that time. Like, so I'm learning how to like be a little bit better as a person while like having this particular type of obsession. And like the team actually makes it to the semifinals. The first and only time that the team makes it to semis. And then they unfortunately get completely killed by the eventual national champions, St. Paul, Minnesota, who had the just phenomenal performers and poets on that team, where they scored in National Poetry Slam, the highest score that you can get or in Poetry Slam is a 30. And out of the 3 rounds, they got 30s, and there's no way anyone was catching them. And it was just brutal. And I was like, yeah, the right team won. We did not come with really strong work here. It's okay. We did good. And and I'm like, okay, everything is going good. Everything is, hey, we finally made a semifinals. The Poetry Slam started in 2001. It took 8 years, but we finally were there. We did it. We're on the right path. And I'm letting this obsession of running a Poetry Slam and then being involved with literary stuff, I'm letting it get in the way of the marriage. And it gets to the point where I'm noticing some things that are very different with my wife, not as affectionate and whatnot. And I discover that through a mutual friend that that Miranda was cheating on me pretty much almost the whole time that we were married. And part of it was probably because of this obsession with poetry and running a Poetry Slam, but there were some other underlying issues as well, but it was definitely a contributing factor. And that's where things just really, like, I look back and I realize, like, wow, if I would have been a better partner to her, maybe these things wouldn't have happened. Like maybe I could have been there. I could have done so many things better. And I think about that all the time, like, because it's okay we should, there's the no regrets thing is just weird. And we should absolutely like deal with our regrets accordingly. And eventually the Poetry Slam, like, people stopped coming to it because we failed when at the big stage, and people stopped caring. And eventually I let it go. In 2011, April of 2011, I decided it was time to end it. That I've been doing this thing for 10 years, and no one wanted to take up the mantle, and no one really cared. This thing that I was so obsessed about, that at one point other people were obsessed about, people stopped showing up. And I announced it. I go, all right, this is the last show. This is the final show. And my now ex-wife Miranda. I got her to come back and host one last time. And it turned out to be everyone who I wish would have shown up week after week showed up, because everyone shows up at the funeral. And I somehow end up winning like this final slam. Like, I inexplicably, I don't know how I did it, but I did it. And I just remember just standing up there on the stage and looking at everybody, and everybody is applauding and clapping. And there's a part of me that's proud that, hey, I did this thing for 10 years and people really enjoyed it, but also, where the fuck were these people when, I needed them to be here and whatnot. And I just stood on that stage crying. And I was like, I'm so sorry. I just can't do it anymore. I can't run a poetry slam anymore. And I worked my way out of this obsession of being a writer and being a poet. And that's when I started slowly working on just being a better human being. So that's how to be a poet instead of being a good person.